Good morning, everyone.
Hi.
Good morning. Thank you. On response. That's right. All right. Welcome to the 2013-14 season of Primetime at the BU Library. Primetime celebrates learning beyond the classroom through the experiences and accomplishments of the faculty, students, and staff. It is a collaborative project between the Friends of the BU Library, faculty development, and many other offices on campus. If you'd like to see what's coming up at Primetime, you can check out the homepage of the library website where our upcoming events are listed. And if you miss one, most are recorded and can be viewed online in our BU Digital Library. Faculty and students, have you assigned or been assigned a research project that requires significant library research? The Friends of the BU Library are accepting applications for the $250 library research prize. The due date is February 15th. You see one of the posters here, and then also here's one of the cards that I believe will be at different departments, and there's also a table over here. Okay, the table right here by the refreshments. Okay. Coming up on Tuesday, November 19th, we'll have Dr. Dan Yim outlines a way to redeem shame from its bad reputation as he presents moral value of guilt and shame. Today we welcome Dr. Carrie Peffley, is that right? Chris Armstrong, Mark Bruce, as they present Why Would a Protestant Evangelical Care About Medieval Christianity? Let's welcome them this morning.
Okay, so we're going to sort of tag team this and hope that Chris Armstrong shows up for our third component. I wanted to address, first of all, why the topic. Why did we choose to talk about this particular subject? So as the three kind of medievalists at this school, the three of us get together on a regular basis to talk about theology, literature, philosophy, and academic opportunities and conferences that present in our overlapping areas. And on one of these occasions, we realized that all three of us had been flagged in our interviews to work at Bethel for our Catholic tendencies. And we had all found this peculiar individually, as none of us are Catholic. So it struck each of us as individually odd, and it struck the three of us as really peculiar that it had happened to all three of us, and all three of us were medievalists. None of us were Catholic, so why the worry? And what was it about the three of us and the way we approached education that made it seem like we were? And surely people must realize that as doing medieval stuff, we're going to be influenced by that period. But surely that's not necessarily a bad or an insidious thing. And so we thought perhaps it just stems from kind of a general misunderstanding of the medieval period and what Christianity looked like, and some sort of fear stemming from that anything in church history before Luther is somehow suspect. And so we wanted to begin by clearing up some of the misunderstandings about the medieval period and hopefully dissolving some fears about medieval church history. And then we want to suggest some ways that Protestants can learn from this period, things that might be worthwhile if incorporated into our spiritual lives. So with that, I turn it over to Mark Bruce to talk a little bit about that.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to start by just drawing a distinction between what I'm going to call medieval Christianity and what I'm going to call Catholicism. And the first important thing to realize is that those are two different things. They're not the same. What we now call Roman Catholicism, the way we use that term in the present, is certainly a descendant of the medieval Roman Church, and it has a kind of historical continuity with that medieval Roman Church that present-day Protestants don't have. But if you think that makes them the same, you might think about whether you think the fact that you're descended from your father makes you your father. Yes? There are a lot of similarities, there are a lot of differences. Sometimes one or the other of those can be a good thing or a bad thing. But the fact that there's a genetic relationship doesn't necessarily make the descendant the same as the parent, right? So that continuity shouldn't prompt us to make the mistake of thinking that medieval Christians were Catholics in the sense in which Protestants use that term in the present. And there are a couple of important things to remember about that. The first one is that for medieval Europeans, the Church of Rome is the only game in town. A medieval European would have identified him or herself simply as a Christian living in Christendom and not as a Catholic. And had he or she used the term Catholic, he or she would have meant it as meaning the same thing as Christian. The Roman Church in Europe in the Middle Ages then encompassed everything about Christianity, from the most sublime and sincere spirituality to the most cynical abuses of power. It was the spiritual home of every Christian at the same time as being the world's first true multinational corporation. It contained incredibly diverse traditions and approaches to spirituality, from the everyday plays and popular songs familiar to every peasant, to scholastic philosophy, to mysticism, to diverse monastic traditions. And medieval theologians were no less prone to having different ideas than modern ones are. And if anything, they were more testy with one another about their differences. So in many ways, medieval Christianity itself, in practice, wasn't that much less diverse than it is now, although that diversity manifested itself in different ways. The main difference is that in the Middle Ages, all that diversity operated under a single umbrella. What makes the term Catholic anachronistic in reference to the Middle Ages is the fact that that term, in the way we use it now, in other words, as a term for a particular type of Christian, only came into usage after the Middle Ages, when it became necessary to distinguish between adherents to the Roman Church and the many flavors of Protestantism. In fact, the first uses of the term Catholic to mean adherent of the Roman Church, in distinction to Protestants, date from a particularly violent time and place in church history. The first recorded use of that term with that meaning comes from an injunction from 1554 of Queen Mary Tudor, otherwise known as Bloody Mary, the English queen notorious for her persecution of Protestants, when she was actively trying to reinstate English Catholics into positions of political and ecclesiastical power. The second recorded use occurs in John Fox's Acts and Monuments, a book published in 1563 after the reign of Mary, when England was trying to become Protestant again. And it was essentially a polemic against what it would have called popish persecutions of Protestants, and was sort of a polemic designed to stir up anti-Catholic sentiment in England. So the term itself is not simply born of the need to distinguish between Catholics and Protestants, but also very specifically born out of Protestant-Catholic conflict, which was a kind of conflict that did not exist during the Middle Ages, because you don't have Protestant. Consequently, to use a term like medieval Catholic is anachronistic in the same sense in which we'd view a term like medieval smartphone, because saying medieval smartphone would imply that the only difference between medievals and moderns was that for medievals, their cell phones couldn't play Angry Birds. Right? And then there's also that kind of genetic fallacy. The fact that something is descended from something doesn't necessarily make it the same as what it is descended from. Right? So while there's historical continuity between the two, they're not the same thing. And I think that might be part of the reason why we've caught on occasion nervousness as medievalists that we might somehow be Catholic or have Catholic tendencies or something, because there's this idea that if we're citing a lot of medieval sources and looking at a lot of medieval theologians and drawing a lot of our own spirituality from medieval writings, that since medievals are Catholics, then that must be Catholic as well. But that's an error in definition rather than something that really exists. So at this point, had our colleague, Chris Armstrong, been here, and we sincerely hope that he's all right, he was going to talk a little bit with you about the way he connects with medieval Christianity as a church historian whose focus started out as modern. And he's currently working on a book, it's actually coming out very soon, about C.S. Lewis's relationship to medieval Christianity. C.S. Lewis was a Protestant who has a very, very strong respect for and draws a very great deal from medieval traditions. And so we had hoped that he would be here to share a little bit from that book with you. But since he's not, what Carrie and I will do is Carrie is going to talk a little bit about the single concept that we're going to concentrate on that we think is a really nice point of access for present-day evangelicals to take to medieval Christianity, and a place where it's our suggestion that we can draw a lot of wisdom and sort of spiritual nourishment from ideas in medieval Christianity that aren't as often emphasized in present-day evangelical Christianity as they could be. So I will allow Carrie to explain that, and then we each have an example from each of our own disciplines of some things that we think might be valuable to take over from the images.
All right, so as Mark mentioned, the single concept that we want to focus on is the aspect of the incarnation. The medieval world is very, very incarnational. And so I'm going to do my best to explain what I mean by that, and then I'll branch into some philosophical implications of an incarnational model of the world. So the medieval theologians, the medieval mind, medieval philosophers emphasize that with the incarnation, God has entered the world to reclaim it, not to destroy it. So God is in the world, and in the incarnation, God's work of reclamation and reformation has begun. And so what we see in medieval theology is that they generally held that God's presence after the incarnation is more palpable and discernible in the world. We see God. And this is because through the incarnation, God has not only saved us individually from our sins, but he's also brought our nature into divine communion with him, and simultaneously has begun to save the whole world, all of creation. And so medieval people, theologians, philosophers, writers, tended to view the world as saturated with the presence of God, completely filled with God's presence. And in philosophy, so now I'll sort of focus on philosophy, this manifested itself in two paths. Within Neoplatonic mysticism and then Neo-Aristotelian scholasticism, so the mystical movements and the scholastic movements are where we see this. So whether you're a medieval Platonist or a medieval Aristotelian, this incarnational model of the worldview affects the philosophy. So I'm going to give just one example of each of those trajectories, of those paths. The example of the mystical path is going to be Pseudo-Dionysius, one of my favorite obscure monks of the Middle Ages. He's a 6th century Syrian monk. And his philosophy is Neoplatonic and incarnational. For him, God is utterly transcendent, but so desirous of his creation that he's found within it. So Pseudo-Dionysius' Neoplatonism allows him to explain philosophically how God is utterly transcendent, but still dwells with us in a very deep and personal way. So for Pseudo-Dionysius, God is first and foremost beyond being. And in fact, his definition, for lack of a better word, of God is that he is beyond being. He is totally and utterly transcendent. In fact, even to say that God is or exists lacks specificity, and sort of it doesn't adequately express the truth of God. And so he writes that God is actually at total remove from every condition, movement, life, imagination, conjecture, name, discourse, thought, conception, being, rest, dwelling, unity, limit, infinity, the totality of existence. So God is completely transcendent from the world, but God is also in all things. God's own love and desire is the basis for all of creation. And this leads the utterly transcendent God to come forth and abide in and with all things, while simultaneously remaining distinct from them. And so he argues in his work, The Divine Names, that God is, as it were, beguiled by goodness, by love, and by desire, and is enticed away from his transcendent dwelling place and comes to abide within all things. And he does so by virtue of his supernatural and ecstatic capacity to remain, nevertheless, within himself. And so through this, the whole universe is filled with a divine longing and desire for God, as God fills the universe with himself and his own longing for the people in the world and the world itself. And so the result of this in the mystical tradition is what a lot of mystics call a fruitional experience with the divine. And so the mystical tradition argues that it's not enough just to know God through reason. That doesn't get us all the way there. But it's also not enough to know God through faith alone, to just accept God by faith. Rather, we need an actual experience with the divine, a fruitional experience, literally one which bears fruit. And this is possible because God is in the world. The incarnation has had this lasting effect, and we're still in God's presence. So God has revealed himself through Christ in the world and is drawing us to himself. And so this aspect of the incarnational worldview is incredibly influential on the mystical tradition. But it's also influential on other models of learning during the Middle Ages, and that's through scholasticism. So here I turn to the second example. And, of course, the great example of this particular path is Thomas Aquinas, 13th century Italian monk. And scholasticism is the movement that began sort of after the reception of Aristotle in the West. And with this reception of Aristotle comes an increased understanding of logic, of physical sciences, of philosophy, and the development of the university system, a liberal arts education specifically, one that's not reliant upon monasteries, so one that starts to move into its own sort of model of learning. And Aquinas is among the first to develop this model in the West. And it's through Aquinas' epistemology, that is his theory of knowledge, that we clearly see the influence of the incarnation on his thought. So I want to talk a little bit about Aquinas' epistemology, which is thoroughly incarnational and Aristotelian. And this is because it sort of allows for truth revealed naturally through the world around us and processed by reason. So we see what God reveals in the world, and we're able to think about that through reason. So though Aquinas agrees that the world is fallen, he argues from this incarnational model that it's being redeemed, and therefore we can trust what we see in it. And so this means, from an Aristotelian perspective, that the natural lights of reason and perception are functional. We can trust them. So as an Aristotelian as well, Aquinas believes that abstraction is the key to knowledge. So he thinks our senses are trustworthy, and it's in perception that all real knowledge begins. And so he argues for a theory of abstraction. That is, this is what abstraction is, the mental act of apprehending some form, quality, or essence without the rest of the object, or considering a form without the whole concrete object in my mind, right? Obviously, I can't have the whole concrete object of a tree in my mind as I think about the tree. So, for example, after enough experience with various frogs, like Kermit and Jeremiah and Freddy and whatever frogs you want to name, I'm able to abstract from these particularities that I've learned about them through experience, through these trustworthy senses, and understand the form of frog without needing the physical objects of frogs to remind me of that. And so Aquinas ultimately argues that the senses are trustworthy and reason is trustworthy, and ultimately can lead us to an understanding not only of things in the world, but also of the divine. So the same method that helps us learn about the world around us leads us ultimately to the divine. And I think, importantly, it provides us as Christians with a ground for conversation with others who are not a part of our faith tradition. So taking his cue actually from a Muslim philosopher, Averroes, he'll argue that scripture and reason don't contradict. Thus, we don't need to fear science, philosophy, or secular learning, because in fact there's no strong distinction between secular and sacred. We need not justify our use of non-religious studies because God has infused the world with himself. So when we study biology, we're studying God. When we study physics, we're studying God. When we study psychology, we're studying God. When we study philosophy, we're studying God. So Aquinas continues on this path and uses analogy for moving to what he calls real knowledge of the divine, and ultimately intimate knowledge of the divine. So God is, for both Pseudo-Dionysius and Aquinas, very much in the world, but also, as I said, distinct from it. So though God has revealed himself naturally in the world, we'll realize ultimately that he is in some way very, very different from his creation. And so the affirmations that we make about God are only true to an extent. But negations also don't get us all the way there for Aquinas. We need analogy, an understanding that through the world we've learned that God is not the same as us, but we are like him in some way. And we can draw analogies from our experience in the world to understand God as the ultimate cause for all things. And so what we see in this Aristotelian trajectory of medieval thought is that God has created a rational, intelligible world, and through using our senses and our reason, through all aspects of study, we are ultimately drawn toward him. And so it is that medieval Christianity gives us a wonderful model, I think, for what we're doing here at a Protestant evangelical institution of higher learning, looking for God in all of our studies. And so this is, I think, what philosophy has to contribute to Protestant evangelicalism. So I'll turn it over to Mark now for literature.
So I'm the literature guy, so I wanted to come up with a literary example. I'm also a really big Latin nerd, and I'm teaching it this semester, so I'm sort of keyed on Latin right now. So I thought I would share with you one of my favorite medieval Latin poems. What I want to do, and it's a poem about the Virgin Mary. And I think that it makes a good example for how we're talking about a sort of incarnational way of thinking as characteristic of medieval Christianity. There is no figure, human figure, other than Christ himself, more closely associated with the concept of incarnation in the Middle Ages than the Virgin Mary. I'm going to share with you one famous example of what was a whole genre of poems and songs in the Middle Ages. They're often referred to as Marian lyrics. They exist in Latin and also in most European vernaculars. Like other popular kinds of medieval works, like mystery plays, the purpose of these lyrics is to use a particular kind of incarnational logic. The idea is always to go for the most relatable human factor in biblical stories and theological ideas, and to find an opening whereby our experiences as flesh and blood, everyday human beings can, when properly directed, become points of access to more transcendent truths. This is the same Aristotelian idea that Carrie was just talking about. Remember that the root word of the term incarnation is the Latin word. I'm going to get into etymology here, being nerdy again. Sorry about this. The root word of the term incarnation is the Latin word carnis, which just means meat. So to be incarnated, especially to a medieval, is not only to be made man in the disembodied sense applied by humanists of the Renaissance and later, much less in the sense of like a Cartesian cogito, or in the sense in which Hamlet, for instance, says what a piece of work is man. Right? It actually means to be made meat. Real flesh and bone and sinew and organ. Real human experience. And that's an experience that includes as much transcendent reason as it does things like stubbed toes and postnasal drip. Just as God had to become incarnate, in other words, enmeated, in order to become reconciled with humankind, the medieval mind recognized that those of us who start out as meat and walk around as sacks of it, in order to understand that very act, have to work the other direction and try to understand the divine through our own embodiedness. Mary provided a strong instance of that kind of embodied access point to the incarnation through her very special relationship to it. While we all have access by grace to the incarnate God, she's the only one who literally gave birth to him. And if you don't think that creates a special relationship, ask anyone who's gone through labor. She is the only one who, having given that birth, had to look on her child as he was mercilessly tortured, her knowledge of the significance of what was happening in no way diminishing her shock and grief as a human mother at the agonizing death of her son. I sometimes hear Protestants get a little uneasy about concentrating on Mary and about the medieval sense of her, as though too much attention to her might amount to giving her a kind of worship that should only be given to God. But as the lyric I'm about to share with you shows, the medieval interest in Mary, and the kind of interest that I think might be illuminating and helpful for we modern Protestants to recover, stems precisely from her lack of divinity and her unique participation in the event of the incarnation as a fully human and in no way divine being. It's precisely her humanity that makes her a point of access to the more difficult concept of the incarnate Christ. For medievals, she thus becomes not an object of worship in herself, but a special access point to our understanding of the sacrifice of her Son. The poem I'd like to share here to demonstrate this concept is a 13th century Latin lyric most commonly known as the Stabat Mater. It's part of a whole subgenre of Marian lyrics that place her at the foot of the cross. This is a kind of move very typical of a popular medieval theological imagination. That imagination, as I've said, looks for the most human element in biblical story, the one an audience of regular people can best relate to in their bodies. Here's the first part of it. I'm going to give you a couple of stanzas in Latin just so you can get the sound and the meter of it. And then I'll read, this is my own translation. So here's a taste of the Latin. Stabat mater dolorosa, juxta crucem lacrimosa, dum pendebat filius, cuius animam gementem contristatam et dolentem, per transilit gladius. Just to get the sound and the meter of it. Here's the translation of the first part. The anguished mother stood, full of tears, beside the cross, while her son hung down. A sword pierced her groaning, darkened, raw soul. How desolate, how shattered was that blessed mother of the only begotten, who mourned, ached, and shook while she watched the torment of her glorious child. Who was the one who could not shed tears if she saw the mother of Christ in such torture? For the sins of her people, she saw Jesus given to torments, to whips. She saw her sweet baby dying, forsaken, while he gave up his spirit. What the poem does already here is begin to access the event of the crucifixion, not from the perspective of a God having become the God-man, but through something to which we regular humans might have a much easier time relating. After all, none of us can claim to know what it feels like to die as the incarnate Christ, but we do know what it's like to grieve. We know what it feels like in the pits of our stomachs to lose someone or to watch a loved one suffer. The poem leads us into that impossible experience of the suffering Christ through the more familiar experience of the grieving parent. While there's a medieval play that's literally called Every Man, Mary here isn't every mom. And the poem leads us to the crucifixion, not by casting us directly into an experience we cannot conceptualize, but one that we can, all too easily. The image of Mary at the foot of the cross brings us to Christ by means of the most broken parts of our own souls, the ones that still ache from our own losses of husbands, wives, sisters, brothers, and friends. The idea in the second stanza of her heart being pierced would be an especially familiar and theologically important one that also speaks to Mary's importance as a human with a unique relationship to the Incarnation. Bernard of Clairvaux, a 12th century abbot, explains it this way. I'm quoting Bernard now. Truly, O Blessed Mother, a sword has pierced your heart. For only by passing through your heart could the sword enter the flesh of your Son. Indeed, after your Jesus, who belongs to everyone but is especially yours, gave up his life, the cruel spear, which was not withheld from his lifeless body, tore open his side. Clearly it did not touch his soul and could not harm him, but it did pierce your heart. For surely his soul was no longer there, but yours could not be torn away. This, the violence of sorrow, has cut through your heart, and we rightly call you more than martyr, since the effect of compassion in you has gone beyond the endurance of physical suffering. Bernard here makes an incredible observation about Mary's relationship to this moment in the crucifixion. When the sword pierced Christ's side, he was past the point of being hurt by it, but Mary wasn't. So the sword that gives us proof of his bodily humanity in that sense passed through her, the mom who had to watch it happen, before it passed through him. Notice that for Bernard, she's not simply special, too, because of her personal grief, but because of her compassion. And the compassion of which he speaks is not her compassion for her suffering son, although that's there, but rather her compassion for us. She, more than any other human being, gave up the most to allow the reconciliation of God and humankind to happen. She watched her son die horribly, suffering even past his physical pain, suffering her own grief for her son, and sacrificing that to the knowledge of what his death would mean for the rest of us. The poet continues from here, not worshiping Mary, but rather asking for the privilege of joining with her in her suffering in order to more properly reverence the suffering Christ. Here's the rest of it. O Mother, source of love, make me feel your sorrow, that I may mourn with you. Make my heart flame in loving my Lord Christ, so I might be pleasing to him. Holy Mother, do this. Drive the wounds of the crucified one powerfully into my heart. Share with me the pain of your wounded Son, who deigned to suffer for me. Make me weep with you in truth. Suffer the crucifixion with you for as long as I live. Make me stand by the cross with you. I want to share freely in your wailing grief. Bright Virgin of Virgins, do not be bitter toward me, but let me weep with you. Grant that I might bear the death of Christ, the fate of his passion, to remember his gashes. Make me be wounded with his wounds. Make me drunk with the cross out of love for your Son. May I be inflamed, set on fire through you, O Virgin, and be defended through you on the day of judgment. Let me be guarded by the cross, defended by the death of Christ, cherished by grace. I find it fascinating that the poet here asks to suffer the crucifixion not with Christ, but with Mary. Again, this is not Mary worship, but precisely the opposite. It's an acknowledgement that the suffering of Christ himself, of the God-man taking on the sins of humankind, is not something we poor meat sacks can share in, precisely. What we can do is stand at the foot of the cross with Mary and share in her all too human suffering. Suffering that she endures precisely because she understands its importance. The depth of her suffering as the one who gave birth to Christ is equal to the depth of her compassion for the rest of us. To quote Bernard once again, he died in body through a love greater than anyone had known. She died in spirit through a love unlike any other since his. To me, that is a love worth learning from. That's what we have. Is there time for questions? Yeah? 2 minutes?
Could you just repeat that last quote? He died in body.
He died in body through a love greater than anyone had known. She died in spirit through a love unlike any other since his. Isn't that groovy?
And his whole name was what?
Bernard of Clairvaux.
Of Clairvaux.
Yeah.
In terms of Protestants, he's, of course, Clairvaux is hymns that have shown up.
Mhm.
Sacred hymn his poem and pieces of very authority that is from the church. And not very much where it's from, but very much a hard religion, pietist. It's very influential.
Pietism would not register as strange to medievals at all, I don't think. Yeah.
Actually, given the tensions that you're talking about, all the way from 3 of you being flagged by Bethel as suspects to this kind of grappling, sincere grappling in medieval mind, St. Bernard of Clairvaux wrote a fair amount about images as well. And he used them and he was suspicious of them. He had that same tension when it came to images, which were a very important role in medieval piety. So I like this feeling you draw out of. I mean, that's the inadequacy of what we are. It's like we're always in danger of lurching to something and making it an idol. But properly practiced, it's incredibly enriching and it's a gateway. So
Yeah.
I like that potential.
And that's very much the sense of Mary, is that what venerating her means is not so much worshiping her as though she's some kind of demi-deity or something like that, but that she is somebody who literally and legitimately has a kind of relationship to the event of the incarnation that no other human being shares, right? She gave birth to that. In both the more transcendent sense, but also, all the messy biology that implies on a human level.
recommend a few books that are more tackleable than others about mysticism that would help me understand more about prayer. I'm going to be doing a talk on prayer in January, and I have my own perspective, but I would like to go back to some of those medieval writers. I mean, I think of St. Teresa or...
Yeah.
And St. Catherine of Siena actually writes a treatise on prayer that's really beautiful and very, very helpful. The works of Pseudo Dionysius are also very, I think, easily accessible.
Is it pseudo the way you would expect it
Yeah,
to be?
Pseudo and then Dionysius. And it's because they thought that he was the Dionysius in Acts 17 saved by Paul the Apostle in Athens. And then it was later that we realized there was actually a 6th century monk. Yeah, his writings are beautiful and sort of help me get into the mind of mysticism.
Do they come with cliff notes?
No.
I mean, also to answer your question, over at the seminary library, Carl Lundquist was very big into spirituality, and there's even a series called The Classics of Western Spirituality, which there are probably some volumes here, but there's actually almost a very close to a complete set over in the seminary as well, which includes a volume on Bernard of Clairvaux, and you might find some pietists and some others in there. So that might be one place to start as far as an introduction to each of these people or concepts. So.
Would you repeat that title for those books?
The Classics of Western Spirituality.
And I know that includes Bernard of Clairvaux as well as Pseudo Dionysius. So the complete works of Pseudo Dionysius are there.
Thank you.
Another one I may mention, this is a Middle English work, although you can get it in a nice modern English translation, is it's an anonymous work. We don't know who wrote it. It's called The Cloud of Unknowing. And that is also a really interesting, very medieval treatise on prayer, much more from the mystical tradition that Carrie talked about. Something that Tolkien was very interested in. Yes, sir?
Yes, in your introductory remarks, you made reference to a parallel between medieval theology and contemporary evangelicalism. I don't think you've gotten to that particular point. Would you like to kind of make that comparison for us?
What that mean? What did I say?
That was the title of your work.
Yeah, the title. I mean, so one of the things that we wanted to focus on was just this incarnational aspect, which we think is helpful. We tend to be, sometimes as Protestant evangelicals, less embodied than the medieval mind was. So we don't think about the physical, biological birth of Christ. We tend to sort of shy away from that. So I think that the incarnational model helps us to step into that medieval mindset. As I sort of suggested at the end of my portion at least, the fact that we can trust then what the body tells us, what the senses tells us, and how the mind helps us interpret that, I think provides a really good model for the way we do higher education and learning. That as Protestant evangelicals, we don't need to fear what's taught in our biology classes because God has revealed himself in the world and we can trust what's going on in the world. So that's at least one thought that I have. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think part of the idea of talking about Mary here is that one of the things I keep noticing that a medieval mind likes to do, especially in some of the more popular stuff, is look at biblical stories and theological ideas and not immediately go for what is the most transcendent truth we can talk about on an abstract conceptual level here, but what's the most sort of human point of access to it, through which we might have an easier time getting to those transcendent things. So for example, there's another medieval genre of literature is mystery cycles, which were a series of plays performed on certain festival days, usually on movable wagons. And it would be a series of plays that would depict pretty much all of salvation history, from the first creation to the last judgment, and then sort of highlights in between. And what they tend to do with those stories is find this very relatable point of access. So for instance, in the Wakefield Noah play, it starts out very briefly with God telling Noah to build the ark. And that's in very highfalutin language and very formal and very abstract. But then it immediately goes to the question, okay, what must the conversation have looked like when Noah had to go home and tell the missus what he just got told? And they have this absolutely hilarious conversation where she just takes it as one of his cockamamie hobbies that he's doing to waste all of his time. And they address members of the audience. And then one of the final scenes is they're all in the ark and they're on the last piece of dry land, and Mrs. Noah won't get on. And so she's sitting there spinning. She's got her spinning wheel and she's spinning and she won't get, and everybody's waving at her, come on, get on the ark, and the water's pooling around her ankles, and she won't get on. But then in a way that becomes a point of access to exactly what a big deal that event really was. Especially when you put it in the context of all of salvation history, which is precisely what the whole cycle does, right? So it's this very sort of humanly relatable point of access to the bigger viewpoint.
I've never heard of that series, Mystery Cycles. Who's behind that? Who's the author?
Usually we don't know the exact author. They were civic performances, so they were performed on particular festival days, usually Corpus Christi Day in England, and each play was the responsibility of one of the different trade guilds in the town. And they often have really kind of funky relationships to the trade guilds. So like in the York Mystery Cycle, the play of the Crucifixion was the purview of the Nailers Guild, the guys who make nails. So the guys pounding in the nails in the crucifixion scene were actually the guys you knew from town who make nails. So it's always trying to find those very connections, not just to general humanness, but like your everyday existence.
So where would one find those, the Mystery Cycles?
You can Google.
Oh,
yeah,
Google.
I mean, if you just want a quick text, just Google mystery plays and you'll get plenty. Yeah.
Okay.
So given the incarnational worldview of medieval Christianity, how is that, do you think, completely inconsistent with a very non-sacramental or anti-sacramental perspective that one finds in contemporary evangelicalism? So how can we truly have a sacramental worldview without believing that the sacraments actually do something?
That's a really good question. No, that's because going along with the incarnational model of the worldview is a sacramental view of what's going on. So sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, no, that's. I mean, in a way, we do kind of have a sacramental worldview because we still do them, which means they must be for something. If they were entirely insignificant, we wouldn't bother. You know. So we might not necessarily. I mean, we don't necessarily think that the sacrament of baptism necessarily, in and of itself, as a rite, works some kind of mojo on a person that saves them, regardless of the movement of their own mind and heart and things like that. But we still find something significant in it. If we didn't, we wouldn't do it. So I would sort of dispute the idea that we don't have a sacramental element.
Yeah,
Protestant.
we hesitate to use the language of sacramentality, but I think the idea that there's something about the Welch's grape juice and the crackers that we use in communion, that there's some reason that we do that, that something is actually happening. And of course, some of the Reformed tradition, like the Calvinist tradition, will still maintain that there's some sort of mystical presence. So that's still there even in some of the Reformation traditions.
As does the Lutheran tradition, for example, as well, in a different way. So you're only talking about certain Protestant traditions, but you're talking about a completely non-sacramental view.
Well, I'd just like to point out, too, that if we're talking about the human connection, eating and bathing are very practical human things, and it's interesting that in the Christian tradition, those become mystical practices.
Yes.
Just the very act of eating and drinking, or washing.
Yes.
In that way, the Lutheran potluck it actually is a sacrament, right? Because we sit down and we eat together, and we have that bodily experience together, and that itself becomes a spiritually significant event. So I mean that really, right? I mean, yeah, meatballs, left side, right?
Okay, Chris.
Oh, Chris.
Is there any advice that you'd give to people who maybe don't know much about church history, or people that wrote in the Middle Ages and would be like their image is that they write about things that we would believe are heretical? Like, are there starting points or kind of assurances for people that, you know, they aren't just, it wasn't dark ages in terms of theology too?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of a particularly
Yeah,
good
a
place
really
to
good
start.
starting point.
Chris Armstrong's good for it.
Yeah, actually, yeah.
Yeah.
Boy, I wish Chris was here.
He's blogging through it right now.
Yeah.
Actually,
so
it's called, what's his blog called?
Grateful to the Dead.
Grateful to the Dead.
Grateful to the Dead, yeah.
Start with his blog.
Yeah.
You can't go wrong.
Because he takes, because of the sort of evangelical Protestant concern about the medieval period, he begins with someone that Protestant evangelicals love, that is C.S. Lewis. And so he finds this is a really good entryway into medieval spirituality. So this beginning point with C.S. Lewis, I think, is a good way to go. That C.S. Lewis was a medievalist. He was thoroughly influenced by this tradition.
I thought the Sacramento question was really great. I also sat here wondering, though, if we can do this apart from ecclesiology. It seems to me the chief incarnation is the body of Christ. And so I wonder how problematic it would be to recover this kind of spirituality apart from a papal, episcopal, hierarchical church with Eucharistic piety. Because that's something low church evangelicals need to be concerned with. They're minding a certain thing, forgetting that it was nurtured in the bosom of a certain kind of church. Is that a problem?
Why would that be a problem?
Because it's the historian. I mean, these are not things, these come out of context.
Oh, yeah.
And they're not done independent or opposition to the church, usually. And so I wonder how connected they are if we're ignoring some connections. Because we like this, right? As individuals, sure, that's just another tool for our spiritual arsenal. But we also probably don't want the authority of someone who has apostolic succession calling us to obey. I think in my own context, as someone who wants to get a useful pass into pietism, but there are probably parts of that I would rather leave aside, and I just want to spoil the Egyptians and take what I like. And the rest of it. It's the tension I have as a historian trying to bring into I don't want to forget where the soil that it came from. Just take what I like.
And of course, pietism itself is something that's working in reference to and picking up on that medieval Aristotelian tradition. So it's shot through with those influences as well. So, and possibly cherry picks some of them. So,
And I think so. Pseudo Dionysius, he's the first person to really use the idea of hierarchy and writes this work, Ecclesiastical Hierarchy, which ends up really sort of cementing this medieval Christian view that the church is very hierarchical, that there is a unified body. But his view is not that there is this stagnant hierarchy that we're sort of stuck in, where there's an apostolic succession. Rather, we have this hierarchy gives us access to the divine, all as individuals. So it keeps us integrated as a body of believers, but isn't quite as regimented as the current Catholic situation is. So I think that might be one way to think of the body of Christ and the church hierarchy as a way of individually moving closer to God. And that sort of connects, I think, with pietism in that particular tradition.
Well, I think go back to Mark's Catholic position. That is very good. That is the body of Christ right there. I just think that's another place in which evangelicals tend to be rather slight as ecclesiology. And so I would think that would be a resource, but I also wonder if we're a little bit more leery of appropriating that resource than mystical approaches to prayer and literature.
But I think part of that is dispelling this notion that there wasn't diversity, because we think church in the Middle Ages, and we don't appreciate that even within what we see often as a very strict framework. There's loads of room for personal expression and deviation from maybe what are often accepted norms as well. So I don't really see how that's very problematic in applying how diverse the body of Christ as a church today looks.
One of the things I notice a lot from church history is that pretty much all the ideas that we attribute to the Reformation, you can find in the Middle Ages.
Actually in the patristic era.
Yeah. Well, I mean, since the Middle Ages are what I'm familiar with, but you know, the ideas of sola scriptura and faith alone, and being able to access scriptures in the vernacular and things like that. You can find those ideas in the 12th century decretalists who are working for the Pope, and in John Wycliffe in the 14th century. So there's nothing particularly novel about the ideas behind the Reformation, except for the fact that there was a set of historical circumstances that allowed them to take off and go global in a way that they hadn't before. But the ideas, you can find those all over the place for hundreds and hundreds of years.
And millennia.
Yes.